Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another in the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's quarterly series of webinars aimed at helping to bring down barriers to health equity in New Jersey. I'm Maisha Simmons, Director of New Jersey Grantmaking at the Foundation, and I'm looking forward to an informative and thought-provoking hour together. At the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we define health equity as everyone having a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible. Achieving health equity requires removing obstacles to health, such as poverty, discrimination, and their consequences, including powerlessness and lack of access to good jobs with fair pay, quality education and housing, safe environments, and healthcare. The Foundation's grant-making in New Jersey is designed to spark long-term change needed to eliminate barriers to health equity for everyone in our state. Our work in New Jersey focuses on three major areas that we feel offer the best chance to improve the lives of millions of New Jerseyans, especially those who have suffered the effects of structural racism for generations. 1, improve maternal and infant health. 2, ensure that New Jerseyans, especially people with lower incomes and people of color, are able to live in safe, affordable, and stable housing in communities of their choosing. And 3, support efforts to create a more stable, robust public health infrastructure that addresses people's health and social needs in the context of community with a focus on equity. These are not the only areas where action is needed. And of course, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is not the only entity involved in supporting the health equity in New Jersey. As a champion for our home state, we participate in coalitions, collaborations, and partnerships across a range of issues aimed at making health equity a reality for all New Jerseyans. Today, we're bringing together 3 of our partners focused on making New Jersey a more equitable place to live. But before I say a few words to set the stage for today's discussion, let me go over today's logistics. This session is being recorded and will be available online. All attendees are on mute. And please submit questions through the Q&A button. There'll be time allotted for Q&A during the last 15 minutes of the webinar. If you need technical help, please contact Jamia at taftcommunications.com. That is JEMIA at taftcommunications.com. Before we get to our panel, I want to share how the Foundation sees addressing inequities in housing and community investment. We see it as an essential pathway to improve equitable health and well-being. For well over a decade, RWJF has focused on the social determinants of health and lifting up how place matters to health. We've increasingly come to see racial equity as an essential lens through which we pursue our work to create health equity and more equitable communities. Housing is not just a critical health determinant on its own, but it is a catalyst for more transformational change that creates healthier and more equitable communities. As we all know, housing policies and the segregation of communities played and continue to play a role in creating the inequities we see today, including what we have witnessed through COVID-19 and its economic impacts. A couple of sad truths. Housing disparity in New Jersey takes place along racial and ethnic lines. 42% of African Americans and 48% of Latinos own their homes, compared to 72% of whites. Black and Latinx are disproportionately more at risk of evictions than whites. What cannot go unsaid is in this conversation, in all conversations about making New Jersey an equitable place to live, is that generations of structural racism have led to policies and practices that cause different populations living in proximity to each other to experience very different realities. Just think about your own neighborhoods and communities. The practice of redlining didn't just deny people of color the ability to buy a house, it also denied them the opportunity to accumulate assets. Over the years, many people gained wealth by selling their house for more than what they paid for it. Those who were denied the chance to take out a mortgage and buy their first house were totally cut out from that path to the middle class. One belief that I have is that New Jerseyans live in a dual housing market, one where the privileged can choose from an abundance of amenities and advantages, and a separate one experienced by people of color and low-income people, which largely consists of low quality options and limited access to opportunity. It's important to note that having a safe, affordable place to live doesn't necessarily mean keeping that place. The two sides of that dual reality are especially vivid today. On one hand, we have people in some neighborhoods selling their homes at far more than their listing price. And in other neighborhoods, sometimes just a few miles away or a few blocks away, people are in danger of losing their homes through foreclosure or eviction. Evictions and foreclosures are all too common in New Jersey, and we will have a great conversation with our panelists about that today. During the pandemic, New Jersey took practical, compassionate steps to ward off those major disruptions in people's lives through a moratorium. Wisely, that moratorium is being extended for people whose incomes make it staying in their homes problematic, even as the pandemic seems to be lifting. I want to recognize our panelists for the roles that their organizations have played in influencing this very positive development. Let's give them a virtual hand clap for what they've been doing. This purpose of the webinar today is twofold. One, to raise awareness and increase our knowledge of how structural racism, housing inequity, and evictions prevent many New Jerseyans from living their healthiest life possible. And two, discuss the need for short-term and long-term systemic solutions, including elevating community voice and addressing policies, development, and investment decisions for low-income and people of color, to help give everyone in New Jersey an equitable opportunity to live in safe, affordable homes and neighborhoods. So now we're at the point of the webinar that we've all been waiting for. Joining us on our panel today are three people deeply involved in helping make sure everyone in Jersey has a safe, affordable, and desirable place to live. Stacy Berger is the president and CEO of the Housing and Community Development Network of New Jersey. Reverend Eric Dobson is Deputy Director of the Fair Share Housing Center, and Maria Lopez Nunez is Deputy Director for Organizing and Advocacy at the Ironbound Community Corporation. I am pleased to have them and their expertise and passion with us on this afternoon. I'll direct most of my questions to specific panelists. If other panelists want to add something, please do so, but don't feel like you have to. I want to make sure we get to cover as many questions as possible on this multifaceted topic. So I'm going to start with Stacy and ask Stacy, can you broadly summarize the connection between where we live and our health?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you and to your colleagues at the Foundation for having me and the members of our network here today. And shout out to both Reverend Dobson and to Maria for being just tremendous partners. We would not have the eviction moratorium in place we have now for lower income families that you referenced earlier, if not for their hard work and the hard work of so many tenant advocates. So it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here today. Where we live determines everything about our health and our future. The quality of the air we breathe, access to affordable quality healthcare, schools for our kids, and employment opportunities. And the data doesn't lie. We know that people who live in greener communities, whether they're greener because they're leafier or they're greener because they just have more money and are wealthier, folks there live longer and they have better health outcomes. New Jersey, as you noted, is a very diverse place as a state, but we're also deeply and historically segregated by municipalities. The persistent pattern of racial segregation in housing continues to exacerbate those outcomes and indicators. Really, every economic measure we could look at shows the same thing. It starts with who could own land, who could buy land, through the intentional highway development patterns that the federal government implemented that cut through thriving, vibrant communities of color, to redlining and credit checks and other discriminatory housing policies. That continue today, some legally and some illegally. Some of them have changed as a result of the advocacy of folks on this webinar. So I'm sure, and I hope that we'll talk about some of the things that have changed. But as of today, Black and brown families have been prevented from accessing that generational wealth to housing stability and to home ownership. And the impact of that housing imbalance, we see it in every possible outcome. Just yesterday, our colleagues at the New Jersey Policy Perspective released a report that detailed the impact of the housing wealth gap on education funding locally. Their research found that school districts in communities harmed by racist housing policies have more students of color and substantially lower income and housing values per student, making it difficult for those districts to raise funding for their schools. And they've recommended some changes in our tax structure to compensate for that. The housing challenges that people face today are, like the issue, multifaceted. There are habitability issues in so many places. In some cases, landlords don't have the resource, but often they don't have the desire to keep those properties healthy and safe. Talking about mold that triggers children's asthma, rodents, and especially something we've in our network has worked a lot on, lead paint poisoning, which is a childhood public health crisis that New Jersey is poised to take tremendous steps forward on due to the recent legislation that's been enacted. But for a long time, we have used our children as lead detectors, and that needs to end. In some cases, the very place that people were told to take shelter during the pandemic are just not well maintained enough to keep our families and our loved ones safe. And that's if you're lucky enough to find a place. I get calls, our staff get calls. I'm sure everybody who works in housing gets these same calls from folks looking for an apartment that they can afford. Our housing market is much like the wild, wild west. It's fend for yourself. Everyone is out there trying to find a place that they can afford. New Jersey has a tremendous shortage of affordable and available rental homes for folks at extremely low incomes at 30% of area median income or less. For every 100 extremely low income families looking for an affordable rental apartment, New Jersey's market only has 32. So there are more than 70 families just without a place to go. Superstorm Sandy and the Great Recession made that tight housing market worse, and we have not really recovered from those things in terms of our housing market. And then if you're lucky enough to find a place, you have to hop through the rental application fee, the credit check, and then if you get through those things, the background check. So even if families are able to find a place, they may wind up on a list that is going to take them a long time to get off of. And that is really not a safe or healthy way to raise a family. The lack of affordable, safe shelter impacts our health outcomes. Enterprise research found just even before the pandemic that lower income renters will put paying housing costs ahead of taking their medicine or going to the doctor. So people are making those unfair and very difficult choices between their health and keeping a roof over their heads. Nobody should have to make that choice in a country like ours. If we can afford to send billionaires to the moon, we can probably figure out how to make sure everyone has a safe, decent, affordable place to call home. Eviction and foreclosure actions raise stress levels for individuals and families. They increase depression. And after Superstorm Sandy, we saw a direct link to increases in suicide. The everyday challenges of finding and maintaining a safe place to live is harming the health of Black and brown families and residents in our state. COVID threatens to make this very bad situation even worse, which is why it's so important that the eviction moratorium and foreclosure prevention are top of our policy agenda. It protects people's health and literally saves lives from that disease and from the ravages of institutional and systemic racism.
Thanks, Stacey. That was a lot to take in, and
sure, I wish I had better news.
Oh no, I know, right? And so
we're gonna get there though.
That's right. And you talked about unfair choices, and you talked about the pandemic. Maria, I just want to pivot to you, and if you can share with us, what are some of the short and long-term impacts of COVID-19 on housing opportunities in New Jersey, and what are some of the policy steps that can be taken?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And I'm really grateful to be on a panel with such amazing people that I am thankful that when the pandemic started, we immediately started working together because, I want to be clear, before the pandemic, we were in a crisis. During the pandemic, we've been in a crisis. Everything is getting worse. But unfortunately, because we've let the inequality in our country get to such a boiling point, I see how folks are numb to it. I think I'm saddened by how much our society has taken that this is just a part of life, how difficult it is to get access to quality housing. It's just a part of life that if you don't make a lot of money, you're probably going to end up with a slumlord who doesn't care. And if you want anything fixed in your apartment, you're going to have to do it yourself, when that is not at all what is guaranteed. Like, we have actually great laws on the books. So I always like to kind of ground myself in that. The laws they're deeply broken, of course, sure, but there's a lot of great things that our partners have been able to push for over the years. However, when it comes to Black and brown communities, there is no enforcement of said laws. So I just say that to say, in Newark, where we have really amazing rent control. Newark has amazing rent control. It should have below market, what's considered below market in our current society, right? However, even with these amazing things, Newark is still an incredibly rent burden when over 50% of the population pays more than 50% of their paycheck. And one thing that always upsets me about that is that's the gross, not the net, right? That is before taxes, they're considering that 50%. And I consider myself very privileged because I have a job and I get to do what I love. But I can imagine that if you were to take 50% of my paycheck and it had to go to rent, what would be left for me? And so that is the great indignity that so many of our community members had to face. And so in the Ironbound in particular, we would see 2 and 3 families living together in a 2-bedroom apartment, like really imaginable situations when you have 12 people who have to share 2 rooms and they have to take turns sleeping. And I am not exaggerating the situation. And one thing that's really come up is just we have so many illegal units of maybe it's a small landlord trying to make it work because housing prices have gone through so much inflation as well that it just doesn't, even for a 2-family, 3-family home, if you're just a small landlord, you're trying to make it work as well. So you're trying to convert that attic or convert that basement, but it's also putting a renter in a really bad situation. So during the pandemic, when people were losing their homes, where people were in these overcrowding situations, that's why you saw in the Ironbound, our infection rate hover and stay over that 51%. And to put that into context, there were other communities, wider communities, who were really upset and had to be shut down for 11 and 12%, right? Well, in the Ironbound in Newark, we were hovering over 30%, and particularly in the Ironbound, where there's such a large, undocumented, and highly dense populated area, we had, in the 50s in terms of infection rate. And then people in our community still had to go to work because they were essential workers in the warehouses, in the supermarkets, the day laborers, right? And so they were spreading this infection amongst their neighbors. And that's why you see such a high percentage of death amongst Latino male under the age of 50 in the state of New Jersey. We are seeing that that COVID-19 killed people along racial lines. And I would argue that housing, right, our redlining was going to always tell you when that death was going to happen. I don't like to seem like I exaggerate, but I do think our society, in not taking housing as a human right, is murdering so many people, especially under pandemic circumstances. And now we're also seeing it become very, very true. It's always been true. We saw it in Katrina, that the housing situation also dictates, are you going to survive after a storm? And so as storms are going to become more frequent, it's something we really worry about in the Ironbound. It's just, again, we're punishing people along racial and class lines, and it's not something our state is doing that well in, despite having amazing laws. The city of Newark can't be blamed for the underinvestment that has happened in our urban centers. They don't have the money to send out code enforcement officers to do the enforcement, the fining, the registrations. We need to upgrade our infrastructure and our systems. And, I always make a plug. We need to make sure that we're connecting with community organizations that are on the ground. So that it's not just think tanks that probably own a home or aren't even renters themselves, right? Who are the ones formulating policies. We need to have a connection to tenants, because tenants will tell us if something's going to work, if this program is going to work, if it's going to be effective. So as we chart our way forward, I hope it's by prioritizing, centering, and following the leadership of those who are most directly impacted.
So everybody on the line today, didn't I tell you we have a great panel? So make sure you're sending your questions and answers through the Q&A so that we can make sure that our panelists can answer questions for you that you have today. And so I'm going to turn now to Reverend Dobson, and Maria said something very interesting. She said, our redlining as a predictor. So I would love for you to talk about what are some of the steepest barriers that you're seeing communities of color having. Maria, everyone has alluded to it, but I'd love you to just put a finer point on that topic for us.
Thank you, Maisha, and thank you, Stacy and Maria. Good to see you guys all again. So, I mean, one of the things I think I focus a lot on, and I think we as a nation don't focus on, as the storytelling about framing the narrative around Black and brown bodies, right? I mean, who's telling the story, who has the power to tell a story is the cause of all the segregation and redlining that happens, because we see Black and brown people was as devalued as European or white folks. So we had this racial hierarchy based upon white supremacy or racist policies in order to keep those in power in power. So one of the statements that I like to talk about is LBJ, and for the younger folks, that's not LeBron James, that's Lyndon Baines Johnson. He made a statement when they were talking about this issue about the narrative shaping and framing. He said, you know, if you convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pockets. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you. And so this whole white racist or white supremacist ideology is based upon creating a racial hierarchy that puts racial policies in play. And so these racist policies have an economic impact on people of color, because many Americans aren't realizing that the policies that have impacted their lives are based in racist power and racist ideas, and for economic benefit of the few, to the exploitation of Black and brown people and poor white people. So the challenge that we have is try to retell the story and reshape the story about Americans' history around what it means to be an American. And what it means to be an American is bringing your entire culture, your ethnic culture, your color into a space and being fully you. And that's the American idea. The American dream, or the American concept, was everyone embracing other cultures and learning and growing from other cultures. And so white supremacists have, and I'm more of a pragmatic approach. White supremacy is just such a flawed concept because it doesn't benefit anybody but those who are right, you know, in a racist policy. For instance, like white supremacists, like many of these folks who laud, you know, Adolf Hitler in their white supremacist stance, don't even recognize the fact that he created World War II that killed 40 million or millions of white people and destroyed Europe, right? Those who talk about the Confederate flag, they walk around with the Confederate flag, not realizing that many people who died, over 500,000 Americans died in the Civil War, most of who were white. They oppose affirmative marketing, which who benefit most from affirmative marketing is white women, right? So these flawed ideas about white supremacy, and Ibram X. Kendi writes about this in his book on how to be anti-racist. These flawed concepts about white supremacy get these folks riled up, to Johnson's point, so you can pick their pockets. And you have these elite folks who get people to try to, you know, they storm the Capitol, and who's in jail? Who got locked up? White people. Like, this is like, yeah, it's, you know, white supremacy is just such a problem from a practical perspective, because even in religion, there is no mainstream of religion that has a white person as the head of his religion. So even they can't possibly like sports, right? Because most of the major great athletes are people of color. So it couldn't possibly like education or philosophy or science, because the great philosophers in the world that ever existed was the Africans and Egypt, the pyramids, and physics was created by the Egyptians. So I mean, and that's to Johnson's point. If you can convince the uneducated white person that they're better than the most educated Black person, you can rob them and pick their pockets all day long. Now, that may be funny or cynical, but what I'm saying, these things have produced policies based upon flawed concepts and ideas who have harmed and have devastated this country and produced segregation, redlining, racial steering, all for the benefit of those who write these racist policies. And to Maria's point, there's policies on the books that we can change if we enforce them. But again, the narrative about Black and brown skin is something that we have to address and attack.
Reverend Dobson, you're Reverend for a reason. You took us to church on that one. So definitely appreciate you walking us through historically and what's happening in the present now as we think about policies that are not adequate for what we need today. And, you know, one of the ones that I mentioned earlier in the introduction is, and you all have worked on, is the moratorium. So I'm going to direct this question to you. Maria, the moratorium is being extended, but, at some point it's going to be over. What are some of the policies that you think need to be put in place to help people stay in their homes?
Absolutely. And, I have so much to say, and I'm grateful to be on this panel because we can be absolutely honest. We need real rent regulation. We need caps on how much people can be charged for rent, because I'll be honest, even like Section 8, it doesn't work. Right. When you have, like I said, 30% of your gross, like, I don't know how so many geniuses in DC have not figured out that we need to change, like, first off, we need to raise the poverty line. Like, the fact that has not been raised to keep up with inflation, that it is not contextualized in how expensive the Northeast is. So then we have government programs that are geared to the most poor, right? And so then everybody else is kind of left scrambling and seeing those lucky few, and they're not lucky, right? Their circumstances would dictate that they're in desperate situations, but our society turns, I think, a lot of people in our society who are struggling, who should be aligned and say, actually, we need to raise what the poverty line is considered. We need to change these government programs. We need to say that 30% of your net, it's what you take home, not, after Uncle Sam takes a bite out of your paycheck, that it needs to just be more affordable, and it needs to be capped. We need real income limits that can stick and that are updated for our modern society. Because how are we using numbers that were developed in the 70s and 80s and we never updated and looked back? So I think that's something we definitely need to surface. And I do want to also fight against this myth of we're going to build our way out of this, because building new affordable housing, that's a lie. I've seen it, like, it's being perpetuated constantly, that they're going to do this inclusionary mix. Actually, they're using poor people to justify building more luxury condos, and then they just give us 8-10 units here, and then we give them all our tax base, our tax abatements, all the benefits and perks, because they're supposed to deliver on affordable housing, and that's just a small percentage. So I definitely want to just be upfront about that. I don't think we're going to build our way out of this. I think that there's more. There's a lot of housing. There's, of course, housing stock that needs to be updated, but that we need to focus on real regulation that puts a limit and updating those poverty limits that qualify people for government help.
Maria, it's interesting that you talk about that, because it's really thinking about a comprehensive way of thinking about the policy landscape that needs to happen in terms of addressing this issue in an equitable way and meeting people where they are in the realities of their income limits. So when we're talking about incomes and resources, we cannot not talk about this conversation and think about landlords. So Stacey, I really want to talk to you and help us understand what are landlords. In particular, we're not talking about big profit landlords, but small profit landlords who are landlords who are people of color, who are really trying to do the right thing as far as their tenants in the communities that their properties are in. Can you talk to us about, what are some policy perspectives that can benefit them at this time as well?
Sure. So I think a lot of what Maria said is will actually help nonprofit landlords and small mom and pop landlords, right? So a couple of things. Honestly, we didn't see the same hue and cry to end the eviction moratorium from our members. A lot of our members, and many of them are on the webinar today, are nonprofit landlords, but they're mission driven. They built homes for people with special needs, people with low incomes, families, folks with supportive housing needs, because they saw that the market was not delivering on the housing that people need. And so we didn't have a lot of folks who were, claiming that they were going to go bankrupt tomorrow if the eviction moratorium wasn't lifted immediately. Unlike what I've really come to think of as the pandemic profiteers, many of whom were represented by the New Jersey Apartment Association, which really led the fight to make it easy and fast to evict people. We have community builders and nonprofit landlords, as well as small mom and pop homeowners, owner occupied property homeowners, who care about their residents and their tenants and view them more as just an income stream. Our members, and I think a lot of folks, worked with their tenants to make sure they understood their rights and had had the opportunity to apply for assistance that was available. And we need to find ways to support those impacted smaller landlords, especially in the owner-occupied properties, to do the same thing. Often those folks are renting to people they know, it's their sister, it's their sister's friend, and they don't want to evict them. They want to make sure that they can stay, and they do need that income to keep their mortgage, but they also want to be, they're fair and equitable to them. So a lot of folks made payment arrangements. They worked directly with their tenants and they helped to maintain the property and did what was needed, and were understanding and compassionate. And I think part of what was lacking from the for-profit world was really that level of compassion and understanding that people were still going to work in many cases as hospital technicians and phlebotomists and janitors to keep their families safe while their landlord was trying to evict them. And so that was really, it was a cognitive dissonance, I think, in the policy arena. I agree with Maria. I think the best policy solution is to limit the profiteering of those large corporate landlords and speculators by limiting rent increases and giving community control over, rehabilitation and vacant property. Rent control is strongly supported by New Jersey voters. We did a poll with the Eagleton Institute out of Rutgers just a few months ago, and that was the #1 policy solution when voters were asked what do they want their public officials to do to make apartments more available and affordable. Rent control was at the top of the list. So we're not asking for pie in the sky. We do need it to be enforced, and we need it to be done well, but that should be on the table as a policy conversation in a way that protects and preserves small mom and pop landlords to be sure that they can collect what they need, but not more than they need. Treating housing like a commodity is not really a thoughtful way to make sure that everyone in our communities is safe. We need to do more in that front. And once again, Maria hit the nail on the head. We need to have universal rental assistance. We have Section 8 housing, and in New Jersey, we have the state rental assistance program, but you can qualify for that and not get it. 75% of the people in America who qualify for regular day-to-day rental assistance don't get it, and they never get it. They're on waiting lists forever and ever and ever. And we really treat that basic human right to have shelter like everyone is in the Hunger Games. I struggle to wrap my head around how we as a civil society allow people to have shelter through their level of fortune or luck in a lottery. Right now, that's the only fair way, but it's not fair, and it's not right, and it's not equitable, and we can fix it. We actually have the money, and Congress is about halfway there. The folks at the National Low Income Housing Coalition estimate we need $180 billion over 10 years to create the kind of universal rental assistance program that America needs. The infrastructure bill has about $80 billion allocated for that. So, we're close. We believe that housing is infrastructure, and a certain senator from Vermont said over the weekend that we're not going to build bridges so people can live under them. And I think that's the right approach to this. We need to make sure that when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about places for people to live that are safe and healthy and affordable, and in communities of their choice. People may or may not want to leave the community that they're in to go find an affordable place somewhere else. So we need to make sure that we have a variety of choices for people that suit their needs and meet their family's desire to be successful and thrive in the future.
Stacey, I've never heard folks talk about shelter as the Hunger Games before. That's the first time I've heard that term. And when you were talking about things like lottery, luck, and chance, none of that sounds like fair and equitable to me. So
it's not.
Reverend Dobson, I would really, because you are at the Fair Share Housing Center, and Stacey, that was a perfect bridge to our conversation with him. What would fair housing look like in New Jersey? Because the picture we pointed is absolutely not fair.
Yeah, of course, we believe at Fair Share Housing Center, the way to go is really to create opportunities for racial and socioeconomic integration. And I agree with Maria to a point. I think one of the things that we have to say that we have underproduced housing, particularly, and that's why we have this housing crisis. As a nation, we haven't produced enough housing, because specifically we haven't produced enough affordable housing because the HUD, the Office of Urban Development, that LBJ again, Linda Bang Johnson, and a Great Society Initiative created the office to create integrated communities. But that office have advocated the responsibility and turned it over to the private sector. And this is what Dr. Keeanga Yamada Taylor talks about in her book, Race for Profit. the private sector have taken over housing, where the government should have been in more control of producing the housing that's needed in order to produce inclusionary zoning or integrated communities. And this is one of the things that we saw on the last administration. The Furthering Fair Housing guidelines was gutted because they didn't want the position, they didn't want the office or the guidelines to produce integrated housing. And that's exactly what the HUD office was doing under the first HUD secretary, George Romney. That name's found familiar. That's Mitt Romney's father. He was out there trying to actually do what the Great Society Initiative was intended to do, what the office of HUD was intended to do, the federal government, to produce integrated communities, integrated housing, because Johnson knew that the federal government had intentionally created exclusion. And he was trying to correct what the federal government had did to exclude people of color or Black people and Black and brown people the opportunity to create wealth. The federal government socially engineered socialism. Yes, the federal government, we have socialism in this country, guys, created socialism and created white suburban communities for white wealth. And so Johnson recognized that, being from Texas and being poor, he's like, you know what? We intentionally created wealth for white folks. We need to intentionally create integrated communities for Black and brown folks that have the opportunity to create wealth. So Fair Share Housing Center's idea and concept about fair housing is to have a fair opportunity to create racial and socioeconomic integration in communities of high opportunities, while maintaining, as Stacy said, those who want to stay in our urban regions, which is, repopulating, have the opportunity to stay there as well. So we have used housing, for whatever reason, we have used property in this country and used zoning restrictions to create wealth disparities in this country. And so what Johnson was trying to do and what we're trying to do is use zoning to make sure it is inclusive and not exclusive. We're whether we want to face this or not, there are parts of our country and our society and our policy that are socialist policies, and they are good. It's funny how many people oppose Obamacare, universal health care, when in 2010, 43% of white people benefited from Obamacare. Like, you guys were being fooled and we're being manipulated around this system of hierarchy around race, and that destroying our country. The biggest threat to our country is not only climate change, which is a product of segregation, I believe, racial and socioeconomic segregation. We're being destroyed by this racial hierarchy. And that's what Baldwin said, to all my white brothers and sisters, not a white person who can prove that they're white. Because the folks who came to this country, they were Dutch, they were French, they were German. And so we assimilate into a system where we're all being exploited. And we're all being exploited, with the exception of those who are in racial hierarchy and have the power and to control the narrative. So Fair Share Housing Center idea of fairness is have equal access and have fair opportunities and have reinvestments in our cities, have investments in our suburbs where inclusionary zoning is in place for Black and brown folks to benefit from that.
Structural racism is baked into our country and into our society, and we are constantly thinking about how to evolve outside of something that is so deeply entrenched. And it's part of my personal beliefs that the only way to do that is to go to the communities most impacted and follow their lead, right? Maria, you talked about that earlier in what you were and when you were saying, the folks in the community, the members of the community know what they need, they know what to do. And so let's talk a little bit about community ownership models of land and housing. And, what are some innovative approaches and ideas that you and your partners are doing and showing us the way in to decrease this inequity around housing?
Yeah, I almost laugh because it's been so hard, and I want to also thank Reverend Dobson, because to be clear, I don't want private developers to build new housing. I agree, like we need more housing, and I think we need more public housing, right? Which is been one of our biggest fights, is the fight to save Terrell homes, which is home to 286 units. And, we could say inclusionary, but so far inclusionary, even in the city of Newark, it's just the developers can bail out, right? They can just pay 125,000 instead of putting the apartment on site. And 125,000, we know is not, first off, you couldn't buy an apartment at that rate. And you're definitely not going to be able to build a affordable unit at that rate. So we need to put the power to build back to the government, the mandate to build, and we need to fix, rehabilitate, and expand something that HUD year after year has been cutting down on public housing. We need to increase how much we're spending on public housing. There's a reason it went, when it was being used by veterans coming back from the wars, it was being maintained. When it was now more Black and Latino people and Indigenous people using public housing, then it just was neglected. That planned neglect that happens, then oh, they shouldn't live here, so we're going to make people homeless. So one of the things that we would love to see is actually public ownership of public housing, right? That the tenants could have determination, say, and control over public housing. We think is a good form of community control. Of course, we can say about community land bank. I will be honest with you and the audience. We've been really thinking of what does it mean? Because one of the strategies with the community land trust is that it is deed restricted. So you can never really sell it for hire. And realizing that in today's capitalist society, owning a home is the way to accumulate wealth. And that's been denied from Black and brown people for so long. So using that as the model, now that we are trying to increase ownership amongst our folks to limit how much that they can make when they sell that home, is a nuance that we're still trying to figure out how to navigate. So I just want to be honest about that is the model with the community land trust. Of course, I still believe in community stabilization and that the community comes first before the individual, of course, but I have to acknowledge and recognize that there is also just inequality built in there, that we're going to help people finally acquire a home and then cap how much that they can make on the resale. Now, if people are committed to living, we're hoping that we can see that in the Ironbound, because the Essex Community Land Trust was just there for historic preservation. We want to see more land trusts that are here to stabilize neighborhoods and stabilize the price of housing in our neighborhoods. And we think that that's a good form of community control, but that is more limited. I would say the larger scale, the bigger win that we can all work on together is to have community ownership and control over public housing, and to really pressure HUD to increase the amount that they're spending on maintaining existing housing and to expand and build new, because we can only at the end of the day but we want to have accountability from our government to provide housing, not leave that in the private sector.
Yeah, accountability. That's the key word. That's the key word right there. Well, I am going to ask my last question, and it'll be to all the panelists. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to populate the Q&A, now is the time to get your questions in. And it's going to be an all-encompassing question. So besides what we've discussed so far, what are some other timely issues that are impacting housing that we should talk about today? I'm going to start with Stacy, and then we'll go round robin around, and then we'll turn it over to panelist questions.
Thank you, Maisha. A couple of things that are percolating, and I did just want to comment on what Maria said about public housing. Part of the Housed campaign that our folks at our friends at the National Low Income Housing Coalition are running nationally is to restore a significant investment in public housing, and I want to say it's 70 billion, but please, I should know that, but don't quote me on it. It's a lot of billions, and it's really important that the entire infrastructure package passes. One of the biggest things we can do right now is make sure that we treat housing as infrastructure, and that 3.5 trillion has about $330 billion, which is an enormous amount of money. But it would, over 10 years, but it would get us where we need to go in order to make sure that everyone has a safe, affordable place to call home in a community of their choice. So we strongly support and completely agree with what Maria was saying about reinvesting in public housing. It's really, for a lot of people, the housing choice it's the only housing choice they have, and the condition of a lot of those properties is really shameful, and the federal government actually tied its own hands a couple of decades ago to be able to revitalize and refurbish those places. So we absolutely have to have that funding in this bill. A couple other issues that are really salient right now: credit checks, because more people of color are renters. The requirement for credit checks, which is not really data driven, it's really profit landlord driven. They want to make sure that they are picking and choosing who lives there, whether or not the data actually shows them anything. So there is legislation. There's been a policy proposal to eliminate that. It's been around for a long time. We are gearing up to try to make that something that goes in the trash bin of history, because it's really a discriminatory housing practice that disproportionately impacts Black and brown families and renters, and just has no place in today's society. Also, there are attempts to modernize the Community Reinvestment Act, and while there are parts of the Community Reinvestment Act, which is the federal government's answer to the redlining crisis of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We have concerns about the regulations that were originally proposed under the former Trump administration and have started to move again. We want to make sure that they are really holding all of the banks accountable for the loans and the deposits, the loans they make against the deposits they take. So those are two kind of big issues that we're focused on. I'm sure that other folks have additional ones, and there's never a shortage of things to work on, but we want to make sure that those two things get the kind of airtime that they need.
Maria?
Yeah, so what else do we need? I mean, you're asking such big questions. I think we need to, for me, it's about centering those most directly impacted. I really strongly believe that is the solution, come away from this whole disaster mess. Because if folks know Ironbound, we actually do environmental justice work, right? And people don't understand the connection between environmental justice and housing. And for us, everything is like environmental justice is not environmentalism, right? It's about centering the fact that because of systemic racism, Black and brown people in this country have been subject to housing discrimination, environmental discrimination, health, education, whatever have you, like a whole actual living environment, which includes us as whole people, has been impacted, right? So that's the basis that we start off. And so in this reimagining of a new society, it could only be reimagined by those that were most directly impacted and those that were hurt by the systems that got us here, right? And we really believe no one else can speak for us, right? We have to speak for ourselves. And we have to trust, like a lot of these policy solutions, you don't have to, and I guess that's a good news for funders, you don't have to fund really big think tanks. You can fund groups on the ground. We have a wonderful partnership with Stacy right now, really just talking to tenants and figuring out what they need. And we could have told them what we had to go out and poll everybody, right, to find out that rent control is what's supported. Folks know rent control is what works, right? So like we can take shortcuts so that we don't have to spend 30 and 40 years trying to get things done. We need to move at an accelerated pace. And it's not just because of climate change. Like I said, climate change is deeply embedded and connected to what's going to happen in housing and who's going to live and who's going to die. And so we don't want the inequalities to only surface during pandemics and storms. We want to think about the injustice of the day-to-day and make sure that we're working on that. And to me, that's about centering those the most directly impacted.
Reverend Dobson.
I think there is so much to grapple with around the issues of housing, and one, we've chosen for housing to be the catalyst for creating wealth in this country, and we did that specifically because property and land use was incredible, valuable for many folks. And remember, during Reconstruction, we had a glimmer of hope to actually produce. Reconstruction had that first opportunity for really this country to embrace integration, social, economic, racial, and it was working. Black folks were given land, and they asked them, "What do you want?" They said, "We want land," and they were given land. They were producing land. Then they stole it and took it back, and just I won't get into all that. Use violence to destroy it, but Black Wall Street as well. But there's so many impediments that we need to deal with: banking, insurance, realtors, the private market, education. There's so much that goes into this issue that we need to re-educate ourselves in this country of how we need to move forward with creating housing as a human right. When Maria said it's so correct, we need more public housing. Now, when people hear public housing, they get all in a tizzy because public housing carries stigmas in this country, where in other countries it don't. So, and here's what I want to tell folks who have a stigma about public housing. This is what you may not know this, maybe you do. If you have a mortgage, you live in subsidized housing. And so this is this re-education that, like, folks, yes, you in the suburbs, with your 1, 2, whatever, you're living in the suburbs, you got a mortgage, the government is subsidizing your mortgage, subsidizing your house. So we need to stop it with these terms and, fragment of creating racial class, and really tell it like it is. Yes, you're getting subsidized housing. Yes, my parents, I lived in the suburbs. We came over and worked hard. Yes, you got subsidies before the federal government got into the mortgage business. You usually had to either build your own house, pay for it outright, or you had to have 50 to 80% down. It wasn't until the Depression where the federal government said, we're going to get involved in housing when all you need is 20%. So we need to stop playing this game and really take it for what it is, that if we can build more public housing, build more subsidized housing, and not have the stigma, and let everybody know that the person who lives in the suburbs lives in subsidized housing too, maybe we can get somewhere. But that's just, I don't want to go on a tangent about this, but it kills me when people talks about subsidies. Most of the subsidies, we're all benefiting from them. And even those in wealthier communities get more subsidies. There are more subsidies going in the suburbs than are going in the cities. People, low income people, pay more for car insurance, homeowners insurance, pay more for banking, pay more for schools. And less services. And most of the subsidies go to the suburbs, the wealthier communities. So let's stop it with this nonsense. And that's just my take on it.
Well, thank you, all of the panelists. Those were the questions that I have. And so I am going to turn now to my the questions that were asked. And what I'm going to do is, for the interest of time and trying to get folks' questions out there, I'm going to pose a question to each one of you. If you you have a couple of minutes to kind of think through and answer them, and so we can get as many questions as possible. So my first question will be for Maria. How will existing housing issues be compounded even further by Hurricane Ida? And what are short and long-term recommendations for assistance? I want you to hold that, Maria. Stacy, this is your question. Many New Jersey municipalities get around housing by subsidizing a few units within an apartment complex. How can organizations support vulnerable populations who live in these units in areas that may not typically be considered low income? And Reverend Dobson, what is the disconnect between policymakers and community organizations that provide support services to Black and Brown communities? What partnerships are vital to support the policies that will address housing inequities? And what are strategies for organizations to get a seat at the table when it comes to solutions? So Maria, we're talking about Ida. You all got it. I don't want to spend any time summarizing. So Maria, go ahead.
Thank you. Like I said, with Ida, what Ida surfaced from the basements, right? It's a big deal in the city of Newark, at least, and we're seeing that New York and Elizabeth were similarly affected. But like I said, there was a lot of exploitation of people already, and I understand. So I want to really be intentional about this. I understand why small landlords, right, and people that live in that home would try to retrofit their basements to make someone live there so that they can make their mortgage, because it's really all gotten out of control. But when Ida came into Newark, I mean, Newark looked like a river, right? Everywhere you went, it was flooded, and it was basement and oftentimes first floor apartments. So if you think about the family living in a basement that is an illegal unit, now the city's coming down on them. And let's be clear, FEMA didn't even declare places like Essex, which has the highest Black population, Hudson with the highest Latino population, Union that had so many deaths in the city of Elizabeth. While counties weren't even declared disasters, right? And you think about, how does FEMA arrive at these conclusions? There was the FEMA declaration fell along racial lines, right? And having to wait, that uncertainty put people in a bad position, and you don't always act as a good actor when you're in a bad position. So now you have a family that you were renting out to, it's all all washed out. All their stuff is gone. And guess what? Undocumented people don't qualify for FEMA. So now they're out of an apartment. And guess what? In today's rental market, they're not going to find another one. And we're finding that people now aren't even renting their basement, which used to be the cheapest apartment you could find. So where are the folks going to go? You know, they don't qualify for a lot of housing vouchers or relocation services. So now you have undocumented people who are just going to be forced on the street. People with criminal records, right, who are going to have a difficult time getting another apartment. And that is like, if they are secured this one, now they are that much behind, and everything else is going to fall behind with it. So we have folks living out of their cars right now who are showing up to work. We heard from the unions, right, like that some jobs were giving people a tough time. Like, why haven't you cleaned up your uniform? Well, you lost all your uniforms and now you don't have money, right? So it's going to compound things that were existing, and people are going to be left behind. And even organizations like ours, we can't keep track of so many folks. They have to move around. They're trying to survive. They don't have reliable phones. All that gets compounded. And I'm worried about the faith of people's future. While a lot of us that maybe it was just your recreational basement, you can get back to business, right? It was a bad experience, but it wasn't life-changing. We're having life-altering things for families that we might never know their names, right? So I just want to be clear. It's hard if you just rely on data to keep a track of things like this, because there is no data. Who is tracking this, right? And it can't be us. And it's definitely not the government. So we're going to lose a lot of families. And I know that is the answer to the question, but it's really depressing. So, you know, it's a very tough situation. I want us to all hold that in our hearts as we move through this.
That's right. That's right. Stacy, 1 minute.
Oh, okay. So the question about inclusionary zoning, I think Maria kind of hit a little bit on it earlier. What, you know, is it really enough to have an apartment that has, you know, 5 or 10% of its apartments be set aside for low and moderate income families? And in some cases, it's just moderate income, so it's like the very, very top of the moderate income, right? When New Jersey does have a law that is not, it's a law that needs to be always enforced, that if you get public funding for your development, as a portion of that set aside has to go to extremely low income residents, so you can't sort of cherry pick or game the tenant application pool. I think what we need is a much more robust single point of entry for anybody looking to rent in New Jersey. We don't have a way for people to even find accessible, available apartments. I get calls literally all day. I got one while we were sitting here from somebody who was displaced by Ida and is being told they have to leave their home by their landlord, and their landlord is asking for keys, and they want to know, you know, where should they look? That's a question that nobody has a really great answer to. And so one of the ways that we can support our neighbors who need a more affordable place to live is to make sure that our towns, everywhere we are, that our towns are doing their fair share and living up to their obligation and responsibility to house our community members and people who want to come live in our community, and that we, you know, we're doing what we need to do to be supportive of people who need an affordable place to live, and make sure that it's not just a single model of development. So if it's just inclusionary zoning, you might not get the number that you need in your neighborhood. We need to have a variety of housing styles and stocks. So we need home ownership, we need affordable rentals, we need kind of everything in between. We need 2-family homes where somebody can, you know, get that equity that Maria was talking about by becoming a homeowner, but potentially also renting out a legal second floor or first floor apartment as opposed to a basement.
Thank you. And Reverend Dobson, 1 minute for yours.
You gonna give a Reverend 1 minute? Okay, I'll take 1 minute. It's very simple to me. The power, if someone asks about how do we get a seat at the table, and I think the power of coalition building is important, right? To build a coalition of people who come together for the benefit of the result of creating good government. I recommend everyone to read the Declaration of Independence and how this Declaration of Independence formed the government by the people, for the people. And it states in that document that if the government is not living up to the natural laws of creating everyone equal, you should replace that government. So I believe in government. I think our challenge in this country is that many of those in certain parties have gotten people to not believe in the government, who don't think the government will care and don't have the power to do anything, and they have given up. We have to believe in this government again and hold them accountable. Yes, we can create good laws, we can create good policies if the people understand they have the power to do it and we're not powerless because we're Black, Latino, gay, the transsexual, whatever. We have the power. We have to believe in that. And that's what I would say is most important.
Thank you. Please virtually clap with me for our panelists. What a wonderful conversation. We are at time. Thank you for joining us today to talk about this very important topic. If you want more information from our panelists, I know we didn't get to all the questions. We're going to send them to our panelists and ask them to respond, and we will try to get them back to you. To learn more about what Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is doing, please go to our website, rwjf.org/New Jersey. Thank you and have a great day, everyone.